Hello all, and welcome back to the YouTube channel of All Day Chess. Today we'll be going over the King and Rook versus King checkmate. And this is going to be continuing our endgame tutorial series. So without further ado, let's get started. And please be sure to if you have any questions, please be sure to put them in the comment section below. And also, let me know what video ideas you want or what stuff you guys want in the future. I'd be glad to make them. So, in example number 1, we can see that we have our king on g2, our rook in the center, and the king on f6. Now, king and rook checkmate is quite difficult, so I don't expect you to get it right away. Let's see. We'll first start out with king to f3. We want our king and rook to be as close as possible with each other throughout this whole checkmating process. So, our first goal is to get our king and rook next to each other. So, let's say the king plays king to e5, then we'll play king to e3. Right, and now our king and rook are next to each other. So step 1 is completed. And just like the queen, we can see that this rook has this box over here. This rook controls this box. So the king can't step anywhere here because the rook will be checking the king. So currently the king has to stay in this box right here. And slowly we want to make the box smaller and smaller. So here, let's say they play king to f6. Right, now simply we can play rook to e4. And now the king's box just became a little bit smaller, and now the king only has this area to work. And let's say they play king to g7 or something. Then simply, now what we can do is we can bring our rook up one square, right? Because if we bring our rook to e5, now wherever the king goes, let's say king to g6 or something, now we need our king, right? We want our king and rook to be next to each other. So we bring our king here. And now our king and rook are next to each other, we're restarting the process. Now this king's box, though, is very, very small, right? And it can go to any of these squares here. Let's say the king comes back to g7. Now we can play rook to f5. And now the box just got even smaller, so this king only has these 6 squares. And now let's say the king comes up and tries to challenge us. Now, if we move our rook here or something, it'll just get captured and this is a draw. And if we move our rook here, trying to make the box smaller, but then the king can escape this way. And now, our box, we have to move back here and try again. So what we have to do now is we simply need to find a waiting move. So that basically means making a move, but the move really doesn't have much of an effect. So here we can play king to g4. And it really doesn't do much. It still protects the rook and the box is still the same size. But the big key here is that black needs to move his king. So black has one of 3 squares. Let's say he goes to g7. Now what we want to do is we want our rook to be on this square, right? Make this box even smaller. So what we play now is we play king to g5. And now this king doesn't have many more options. Let's say it plays king to g8. But now we can simply play king to g6, right? And now our idea is to play rook f7 and make the box even smaller. Or is it? This king can't go anywhere except for one square, king to h8. And now rook to f8 is a brilliant checkmate. But let's go back a little bit. Instead of going king to g8, what if they play king to h7? Well, what we can do now is we can play rook to f6. The box just got even smaller. And now let's say the king moves somewhere, right? And now what we have to do is we can make another waiting move. But the problem is if we make too many waiting moves, it's not good, right? And there's something called a 15 move rule where you need to move a pawn or capture a piece, or else in 15 moves it's a draw. So now the king moves over to h7 again. Now we can play king to g5, and when king comes back to g7, now we need to do something else. We can play rook to f5. Now this is a waiting move. Our king and rook are still next to each other. And the idea behind this is the king can't come to any of these squares, right? It can't come to g6, it can't come here, f6, h6, can't come to any of these squares. So now the king has to move somewhere. And now what happens is we play king to f6. The idea behind this is if the king tries to escape, which obviously it can't, because let's say king to g8, then we simply play king to g6 again, and we have the same position, and it's checkmate, right? So now, let's say the king plays king to h6 or something. Now we simply play rook over here. Rook to g5, king to h7, rook h5 check, king g8, and now rook h4, a brilliant waiting move, and now the king has to come to f8, and now we play rook to h8. I know it might have been confusing, but the main ideas you need to remember are 1. We want our king and rook to be next to each other most of the time. So we want the black king not to be able to move to a bunch of squares. And next, we want to corner the black king and find a couple waiting moves that don't make much of a difference and then checkmate the opponent. So now let's move on to example number 2. In example number 2, we'll be playing the black pieces. And let's say white starts out. White will play here. And our first step is to bring our king and rook together, correct? So we'll play rook to f5. Now our king and rook are together and we have created a box and the king cannot come outside of it. So now the king has to move, let's say, back here, for example. And now what we want to do is we want to make the box even smaller. So we can play rook over here. Now this box got even smaller. And let's say they try and attack us. Then we simply support with our king. And now the box is small. And let's say the king moves. Then we make the box even smaller. Right, so our goal here is just to make the box smaller, and our king and rook just make sure they're together, and we'll keep moving forward. Now let's say they play king here, for example. Now we can't play here, else they'll capture us. So we can play king to e3, and our next move idea is to play rook here and create our box. But now let's say they play king back here, for example. We'll still play rook here, the box is still there, and now king here. Now, if we move our rook here, then they simply escape. If we play rook here, then they capture, and it's a draw. So we need to find a very important waiting move. Now, waiting moves usually aren't great, but this waiting move is kind of awesome. We'll play king over here. The idea behind this is the king still supports the rook, and now it's white's turn to play in a very similar position. So now when white moves, we can now simply advance our king, and now our threat is to play rook over here. So king back, rook over here. And now the king, let's say, goes to b1 or something. Let's say king to b1. We can go king to c3. Now the idea behind this is if the king tries to run away, then now we'll play rook to d4. Now the box does get bigger, but not for long, as after king b1. Now what we have to do is, let's see, we can move our rook anywhere on the board basically. Because now when we play rook here, for example, rook to c4. Oh, but then they have king to a2. And then let's say we can play rook to f1. And now they have to play king to a3. And rook h8 is checkmate. So instead, if we play rook to a4 instead of rook here, then they have to play king to c1. And rook a1 is checkmate. But let's say instead of coming here, they decide to play king h7. Now what we play is we can play king to c3. Our idea is to play rook here and make the box even smaller. And now king a1. Now we can simply play king to c2. The idea behind this is now it's a very similar position as you remember when the king was on g8 and this king was also on b3, and then we play rook here, like the position like we encountered before in example number 1, right? But now it's kind of flip-flopped sideways. So now the king has to come to a2, and rook a4 is checkmate. I know this concept is very hard, and we'll go over a review or something like that in a different video. But for now, thanks for watching.